systems nominal.
Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow mech lovers, welcome to the show and welcome to Steel Battalion. This game. Oh man, those of you who've been watching my videos for a while now, you know I like my mech sims. I've reviewed and played a ton of them on the channel. I even did a live roundtable discussion with Phil Sean Lang and Noah Tebben on the subject about a year ago. Suffice to say, it's one of my little joys in life, along with, manly barbarians with big swords and loincloths. And now, here we are with a game that I can say with utmost sincerity is a damn fine example of the genre. One of a kind in many ways, especially considering its nature as an original Xbox title. I mean, Steel Battalion, or Tekki as it's known in Japan, was released 22 years ago in 2002 by Capcom, developed by Nude Maker, an oddly named studio to say the least. It retailed for about $200 US in 2002 money, and came with the infamous controller setup that is the first thing most people think of when you mention this game to them, for obvious reasons, let's face facts. Now, there have been other controllers in the past that could compare to Steel Battalion's, or at least we're aiming in that direction. The Sharp Cyber Stick for the Sega Genesis, for example, or there was the what was it called, PlayStation Analog Joystick, I think it was called, that came out back in '96. But nothing on console up to that point had taken it this far, and I don't think anything has ever since. I mean, 2 joysticks, 3 pedals, 5 switches, throttle, radio dial, and a shitload of buttons. I think about 40 total. I mean, suffice to say, this thing is goddamn impressive and heavy. I'll tell you that much. Putting this thing together, you want to be careful about that. Now, I say this on console, right? Because on PC, which is my usual neck of the woods, the setup like this, it's not that unheard of. Between a full HOTAS rig or just, mouse and keyboard, you could pull off something just as extensive in terms of the number of inputs, and it shows when you look at how many simulators you've had on that on PC ever since. I mean, some pretty complex ones too. And hell, many of the classic mech sims of the 90s that I know and love were designed with joysticks in mind as the primary input method. Same thing for flight sims and space combat sims like TIE Fighter or X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, all those ones. Wing Commander. I'm thinking especially for mech sims, the first 2 Earth Siege games, if you've ever heard of those. They would eventually go on to be Star Siege after that, and then the Tribe games would be spin-offs. Those ones required mouse, keyboard, and joystick to get it all at once, to get the most out of them. It's a very interesting setup. I should probably do a video on those games. Anyway, this is all to say that having a controller this big isn't really all that unusual for a mech sim. What is, of course, unusual is that this is one that is custom-made for this one game, and its sequel, Line of Contact. But anyway, never mind that. Get to that at some point. My point is that aside from the fact that this one is on console, where this kind of extensive control setup is notably unique, here it's specifically tailored for the game, which I think goes a long way to enhancing what a good mech sim is all about in this case. Immersing the player in the experience of piloting a mech in combat. I mean, as you can see here on the screen, it does a pretty good job of that, right? I gotta say, it's hard to imagine another game doing it as well as this without going full VR, and even then, it would lack the physicality of having your hands on the actual joysticks. Pulling your targeting reticle into position, locking on an enemy mech, and just unloading your arsenal until he's scrap or you are, Because here's the thing, the controller, it's impressive, as I said, but it's only one aspect of the whole experience. It's a big part of it, for sure, because let's face it, having a one-to-one replica of the mech's actual controls right in front of you is pretty damn immersive in and of itself. But it comes together with every other part of the game. The aesthetic, the sound, the visuals, all of it is very cohesive. And that's something very important for any kind of simulation game. The whole has to fit together to maintain the player's suspension of disbelief. It doesn't matter what kind of game it is, or even if it's a video game at all. Tabletop RPGs and board games also fall into this kind of thing, in my opinion. Whatever events, the world, or setting the game is trying to simulate, it requires specific attention to making sure all those individual pieces come together as seamlessly as possible. All the mechanics, the artwork, the fluff, the color that informs the nature of the world itself. All that has to fit in that case. If, say for example, we're taking a World War II tank simulator, there's a bunch of those on the market already. You need to know the stats of the machine, the strengths, its weaknesses, what it was like to operate in the field for, the soldiers during that time period, what kind of battles it participated in, who and what it fought against, that kind of thing. You need to know this stuff in order to make something that actually provides the experience, at least something close to the experience, of operating that machine in a video game, right? In the case of sci-fi vehicle combat sims, well, that's a lot harder to do because the thing you're simulating doesn't exist, In the case of something like the MechWarrior series, it's helped by, Battletech tabletop game. Has a whole bunch of background technical info to base things on. Same thing goes for the Heavy Gear video games as well. And obviously for, X-Wing versus TIE Fighter or anything like that, you've got an entire movie series that you can look at in order to get, the good feel of how you're supposed to do things, right? But for Steel Battalion, though, there's no pre-existing info to work from. So what do? Well, what they did was they inverted the process. Instead of basing the gameplay on the existing vehicle, like you would in a normal sim, they built the vehicle to suit the gameplay, and then, this part's important about it, people, they create technical and setting justifications for those vehicles. This is why the Steel Battalion manual is the way it is, for instance. It honestly reads, if you take the full manual there, it reads like an actual vertical tank instruction guide. It's full of diagrams and mechanical explanations that don't have gameplay purposes, in that they're not, knowing this stuff, or how the battery operates, or how the basic mechanics of the joint cell work together and stuff like that. None of that is actually going to help you play the game, but it gets you in the right mindset, right? It even goes so far as to tell you the regulations on food ration storage on board your VT. Little bits of color like that. They're little bits of, not necessarily useful for gameplay, but useful for getting you immersed into the gameplay. You can thank military advisor, by the way, military advisor Toshiyuki Kikuzuki for stuff like that. He's the one who did a lot of this kind of extra detail. Now, there's also the general setting of Steel Battalion. Well, for that, you're not going to get much of it in-game. This game is pretty short on story. The best source for that is the Techie Official Encyclopedia book, which unfortunately hasn't been officially translated from Japanese. Which is too bad, because it covers, the history of Steel Battalion, in-game history, all the different equipment, all the VTs, and also includes a whole bunch of interviews with, the people who made the game, so it's a great reference. And thankfully, the folks over at the Steel Battalion Online Discord are hard at work translating that, page by page. So, kudos on that, because otherwise I wouldn't have any idea what the hell's going on in there. From what I have been able to read of it, it actually reminds me a lot of Front Mission setting. That's another series with a big-ass lore book I can't fucking read. You've got, the geopolitics. You got the international power blocks, conflict over an island in the Pacific, although in this case it's a larger outside force versus a local government to declare independence instead of two foreign powers fighting over it, plus various conspiracy shenanigans. The funny thing, if you actually look at some of the side stuff that came up for Steel Battalion, the cockpits actually kind of look the same. It's a fun little thing. I think they could probably make a pretty good pretty good Front Mission mech sim if they actually felt like it. Square Enix got off their ass and actually made another one. Alright, so basically, in terms of the setting, the gist of it is a massive uranium ore deposit was discovered on this little island called Haishi Dao, somewhere between East and Southeast Asia. That got the attention of the Pacific Rim Forces, which is an economic and military bloc made up of about 12 Asian nations that formed after the UN dissolved sometime in the future. So a ton of people and businesses moved in to exploit the uranium. They even went as far as to artificially build up the island by an extra third of its original size. And this massive influx of business and people made Haishi Dao a major trade hub in the region, like serious economic power. And it also created increasingly intense strife between the settlers and the original native population, who felt mistreated by all these foreigners and, not privy to all the benefits of having all this business around. This eventually came to a head when a guy named Gurmit Singh was elected president of Haishi Dao on August 2nd, 2080, who then went on to declare independence, broke all ties with the PRF, They then nationalized all the foreign assets on the island and went so far as to launch attacks on other nearby islands, including the PRF Training Division base, where we find ourselves as the campaign begins. After that, PRF Army invades, and we have a front row seat from inside a VT cockpit for the entire campaign, which takes place during 2080, then having a 2-year ceasefire before starting up again in 2082 for a second campaign. That one is basically a remix of the first one with tougher enemies and a couple of new missions, including a new final boss. So, all this to say, this is a very grounded story told through pre-mission briefings, radio transmissions during missions, and only a very few cutscenes. It's very dry and matter-of-fact, which I feel fits the concept that they were going for. I know it's not going to be to everybody's taste, obviously. Some people want a bit more character into their mech games, but here, what they were trying to do was make a mech game that felt like it took place on a real battlefield. There's mention in interviews of how they deliberately wanted to avoid something that felt anime-esque, if that makes any sense. Instead, they wanted the VTs to just be that. Vertical tanks. Just walking war machines, you know? Like, if this was Gundam, all the VTs would be Zaku's. Like, imagine that, an all grunt mech aesthetic, basically. If that makes any sense. Of course, there's still a little mecha anime in the game's DNA. I mean, the very first thing that happens is your barely trained rookie pilot gets caught in the initial attack on the base and jumps into the brand new M7 Decider VT so you can fight off the enemy and try to stay alive after the base gets attacked, you know? You at least have some idea of what you're doing, so it's not quite so bad as it could be. You're Krim Kashim. You're not Amuro Ray in this situation, you know? Yeah, you gotta know I gotta throw in a Dogen reference somewhere in there. Actually, you know, now that I mention that, if there is an anime that this game reminds me of, it's another one by Ryosuke Takahashi, the guy who actually did Dogen and Votons, you know, this really, really, real robot ones. And that's one called Flag, if you've ever heard of that one. That one is probably one of the most real robot of all the real robot mecha animes. It's a weird kind of, it's an anime, but it's also a found footage movie. It's worth checking out. It's really good. And honestly, I'd say Steel Battalion has a similar rank in terms of video games. Runner-up would probably have to be the Gun Griffin series, something that I've mentioned before elsewhere when I interviewed Razor Stoge previously, the guy from the Steel Battalion Online community. Mentioned on Twitter too. It's especially the first two on the Saturn. Those ones really, really had that kind of like grounded inside the cockpit of military vehicle kind of feel to it, which is surprising because Saturn's not exactly has the most extensive amount of buttons on those controllers. Those ones, they're doing in their own way what Steel Battalion did, which is try to make the gameplay feel as believable as possible given the means that are available to them. And a lot of that goes into that aesthetic I was talking about. The VTs look and feel like heavy, functional machines designed as bipedal weapon platforms first and foremost, before any kind of aesthetic kind of flourishes were put in or anything like that. There's no eyes on these things. You don't have a face on these mechs. They're not designed to be, popularized as toys. These things are just, walking tanks, again. And it's also something that goes a long way to differentiate this game from other mech sims beyond the controllers, how low-tech these mechs are, actually. I mean, even the most advanced, even when you get to the more advanced second, right here, just moving on to a second-gen one here, you can already see the difference in terms of the display. But even this one and the third-gen ones that you eventually get to pilot, think about it. How many mech sims have you played where you can run out of fuel? Not a whole lot, right? Now, most either ignore it entirely or have mechs that use fusion power, fusion engines, and don't have to worry about it. I mean, in real life, military vehicles like tanks and jets are some pretty serious gas guzzlers when they're going all out, sometimes with fairly limited deployment ranges, actually. Another thing that comes to mind also is the weapons that you have equipped. If you look over the arsenal that you can use in Steel Battalion, you'll notice that there really aren't any energy weapons to speak of. No lasers, no particle beams, plasma cannons, anything like that. The closest you get are railguns, which are advanced, but they're still kinetic projectiles. I mean, we're starting to develop those things right now. There he goes. And you can see they're pretty effective. They just fired one of their Vits, which is the dinkiest of all the mechs. The other ones are, the plasma torches, which is a repurposed industrial tool used as a melee weapon. In fact, canonically, that's how they figured out, this might be useful. There was an accident in one of the factories, and a VT got hit by one of them, and just got knocked flat on its ass, and the makers were like, this could be useful. And eventually, of course, the final thing would be the Gauss emitter, or Gauss cannon, that's used by the final boss, the D3I, and in line of contact by the Earthshaker VT, which actually got it by reverse engineering the one from the final boss. It's basically the same gun. And that thing's a energy hog directed EMP emitter that can shut down VTs and force them to restart. Although, you think about it, you give it another couple of decades of R&D, you could see it being a precursor to a MechWarrior-style PPC. You just got to focus that blast into this little pinpoint beam, and it could do some serious damage, right? Everything else is either a cannon, a missile, artillery. It's all conventional weapons you can see being used on battlefields today. It reinforces that believability. It makes it feel less like sci-fi and more real. And this also goes into something that I started thinking about when playing this game, and that's that a good sim game is defined by its limits. What it doesn't let the player do. VTs are capable of a lot, but compared to mechs and other games, they're still just big walking tanks. Again, you push it too hard or too fast, and you'll find yourself face down in the dirt while some guy in a dinky Vits takes potshots at you, and he doesn't even have a color monitor, for God's sake. You cannot take too much concentrated fire from other VTs. And smaller vehicles, sure, and they're not much of a threat, because they're really not much of a threat to you at all. Most of the tank guns just bounce off the armor on these things. But then again, your targeting systems aren't even designed with them in mind. So you can't lock on or use the effective range indicators on your reticle, so you just have to aim manually. I mean, machine guns really help with that, especially for helicopters, but you still have to take care of that stuff. Unless, of course, they're tanks. In this case, you can just step on them, of course. But, easier said than done, given the visuals. And you're always dealing with the limits of what the mechs can do. You can't go too fast while turning, or you'll fall. You can't dodge too much, or you'll drain the battery and no railgun for you. Can't overuse the override on the second and third gen mechs to instantly charge that battery, or you'll burn up your fuel supply and be stuck. I mean, I hope you requisitioned a resupply before the mission, or you just became target practice. And if you did, hope there aren't any enemies nearby when you call in that resupply chopper, or it can be shot down and you just lost 2,000 supply points worth of stuff that could have gone towards your next VT. This kind of thing also applies not just to mech sims, but sims in general, immersive sims, for instance. You think of something like the original Deus Ex, for instance. A lot of the creative solutions that the player will come up with to deal with situations in there is dictated by the limits on your character. The limited number of skill points you have to spread around in your skills, the limited amount of inventory space you have to carry all the weapons and gear that you want to use, the limits on which cyber and nano mods that you can have installed, since they're mutually exclusive. All these things, these limitations, are what forces you to adapt and come up with solutions to these situations at hand, and to try to accomplish the different objectives that the inputs in front of you. Because it's really one of those things. You have yourself in this situation, and everything else goes in to reinforce that. Like, for instance, the visuals, play into this as well. The reduced visibility from the video display forces you to keep the camera moving around, keep an eye on the proximity warning lights when you're in close quarters. Watch your radar for coming shots and coming enemies. Flip through secondary camera modes so behind you and stuff like that. The screen feels cramped with all the dials and readouts and ammo counters crowded around this place. So when you get to the third gen, like you're seeing right here, and it's all projected on your HUD and it's nice and clean, it's this massive relief. Just because the wider field of view and image quality, you take that, add the sound and alarms blaring from incoming shots, the boom of your own weapons firing, warning lights going off on the screen on your controller. You take all that, you add wrestling with this huge analog controller, and then add the fact that if you get your mech shot out and don't hit that eject button in time, you're starting all over again from scratch. Yeah, the other thing this game is known for, permadeath. And it's no wonder a lot of people get overwhelmed when playing Steel Battalion for the first time, and just can't get into it. And also, concurrently, why so many people absolutely fucking love it. There's nothing else really like that. That combination of elements, that particular mix is unique in that regard. Now, all that doesn't mean that there wasn't room for improvement, obviously. The game pushed the limits of what an Xbox could do in 2002, and that's reflected most visibly in the limited draw distance. Easily see that in more like city levels or levels that take place in cans, stuff like that. There's some very noticeable frame rate issues as well when there's a lot of stuff happening on screen, lots of projectiles happening. The AI and your allies is, well, let's just say I wouldn't stand near them in a tight space unless you really enjoy the sounds of metal scraping on metal. They're mostly useful for, occupying the enemy and just, soaking up shots that you don't have to, especially in the 2082 campaign, where you actually are in command of a squad and can have two extra wingmen that you can order around with the additional comms buttons in the dial. And there's also two little points as far as the game's focus on realism that kind of sacrificed in terms of playability. One, projectiles move way slower than they do in real life, so you can actually dodge them halfway effectively. You can, like, when you fire a cannon, you can actually see the discarding sabot didn't discard it. You probably wouldn't be able to see that except if the game was already in slow motion in real life. And the other thing, and this was brought up a bit by the mechanical designer of the VTs, Junji Okubo, he mentioned this during interviews, that there's not really a good way for the VTs to actually get up after getting knocked down, since they don't really have arms. I mean, they have the guns, and it's really cool to see having them have the way they kind of like fold in and out in order to deploy when you switch weapons, but you can't really get up with those. It's like at 209 falling over, you know what I mean? And the sequel Line of Contact, they had it so that the mechs kind of flip over and move up. So I'm assuming they put there's some kind of like little levers or something that you can't see, but that is a little something there. Also, and this is more of a personal note, there's no locational damage. VTs operate at full capacity until they finally get blown up, and this is actually something that was changing with Line of Contact, where the VT's legs had their own armor pool, and if you legged one during campaign mode, you capture it and could use it yourself. And afterwards, the much maligned heavy armor had some parts of your mech that could be damaged or destroyed in battle, not the least of which your crew inside the mech. So they were kind of going into that direction a little before the goddamn Kinect fucked things up for everybody. That was a shame. I think what's really impressive ultimately with Steel Battalion is that the people at Nude Maker had an opportunity to go ahead and make the game they always wanted, and they not only took that opportunity, they fucking ran with it, right? Steel Battalion is what happens when you have an ambitious studio with a coherent vision and the balls to make it happen. I would have loved to see this game get a few more sequels, see what they could have done with the advances in VR tech over the years. Hell, I'd even like to see Steel Battalion Heavy Armor get a PC port and see if maybe, without the Kinect jank holding it back, the ideas in that game might actually work, because there's some good ideas in there. As it is, this game is more than just some gaming curiosity, and has definitely stood the test of time. I mean, I have wanted this game for at least a decade and a half since I first heard of it. I played it once or twice at a friend's house, and then I finally managed to have the opportunity to put cash down and get my own example of it. And yeah, this thing is one of a kind right here. I'd say it'd be even worth playing without the giant controller. The gameplay itself stands up well enough on its own. Although I would definitely say it would not be the same experience at all. I'd say that. Now, I'm not going to tell you all to immediately go out and get it. I understand that. I'm more than aware that this is probably way more of a hardcore mech game than a lot of people would be willing to have the patience or budget for. So, no judgment on my part when it comes to that, okay? But if you're like me, yeah, you want this thing. As the producer of the game, Atsushi Inaba, said during an interview, this game, it is the dream of men. Yeah, I can definitely see this is some people's dream come true, and I am glad to finally be able to, play the hell out of this thing. On that note, I have been Zero Sum. This has been Steel Battalion, and I'm ejecting. Bye-bye.
All primary objectives complete. Mission successful.